These are ghost stories that will mess with your head and make you think twice before ignoring certain signs. Like the story you're about to hear, where a simple meow in the middle of the night revealed something much darker and impossible to explain. But before we jump into it, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any terrifying stories, and tell me in the comments which city or country you're watching from. That night, the silence felt heavier than usual, as if the air in my bedroom carried an invisible weight. I was lying there, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a distant meow. It wasn't uncommon to hear cats roaming the neighborhood, but there was something off about this sound. It was drawn out, almost dragging, like it was coming from somewhere deep, too deep, and it had an eerie, almost human-like quality to it. At first, I thought it was just two cats fighting outside, maybe on a rooftop or in a neighbor's backyard. But as I listened, I realized the sound wasn't moving. It stayed in the same spot, constant, like the cat was just standing there, calling out to me. My body tensed. I tried to ignore it, but the meow seemed to slither into my ears and nestle inside my head. I decided to get up. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and walked over to the window. Outside, nothing. No movement, no sign of life. The street was empty, lit only by a flickering street lamp casting a sickly yellow glow over the pavement. Then, the meowing stopped. The sudden silence made my heart race. The absence of sound was even more unsettling than the meow itself. I shrugged it off and went back to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But a few minutes later, the meowing returned. Only this time, it was louder. Much louder, and it was coming from inside the room. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my throat. I turned on my phone's flashlight and scanned every corner of the room. Nothing, no cat, no movement. But the feeling of being watched was so intense that the hairs on my arms stood on end. It was like something was there, just standing in the darkness, staring at me. I sat frozen for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what was happening. The negative energy in the room felt almost tangible, like something had taken over the air itself. I took a deep breath, turned off the light, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but it wasn't peaceful. I slipped into a lucid dream, one of those where you know you're dreaming, but you can't wake up. I was running down an endless, narrow hallway, feeling something chasing me. Couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was something dark, something otherworldly. Its presence was suffocating, like it was draining my energy with every step I took. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, all I saw was a tall, distorted shadow, moving in jerky, unnatural ways as if its body wasn't entirely solid. The experience was so intense that even in the dream, I could feel my real body locked in place, unable to move. When I finally woke up, I was drenched in cold sweat. The first thing I noticed was the open window. I was absolutely certain I had locked it before going to bed. The cold night air rushed in, making the curtains sway, and the sound they made was almost like a whisper. And then I saw it, a black cat, perched on the windowsill, staring right at me. Its eyes glowed unnaturally, reflecting the dim light from the street lamp. It didn't blink, it didn't move. It just watched me, as if it knew something I didn't. I was transfixed for a few seconds before realizing something was off about the way it stood. Its movements were too subtle, too calculated, and there was a faint tremor in its form, like it wasn't entirely stable. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I knew with absolute certainty, this wasn't just a cat. The cat remained motionless, staring at me as if it were reading my thoughts. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like an invisible force had latched onto my muscles. My breathing became shallow, and a strange heat rose in my chest as the air around me grew thicker. I'd heard about sleep paralysis before, but I'd never experienced anything so real, so suffocating. Instinctively, I began silently reciting a protection prayer my grandmother had taught me when I was a kid. At first, the words stumbled in my mind, but with each repetition, I felt something trying to stop me. The cat, or whatever it was, tilted its head as if curious or annoyed by what I was doing. Then, right before my eyes, its form began to distort, Its fur seemed to dissolve into dark smoke blending with the shadows in the room. Its body stretched in impossible ways, its paws twisting into something more like bony claws. Its head lost its feline shape, becoming an irregular outline, like a cloak made of pure darkness. The negative energy in the room intensified, pressing against my mind as if it wanted to erase me from existence. I kept repeating the prayer, faster and faster, with a desperation I'd never felt before. The creature drifted closer, floating through the air as if gravity had no hold on it. There were no footsteps, just that oppressive silence, broken only by the distant echo of my own heartbeat in my ears. When it got close enough, I felt a sharp coldness on my skin, and a wave of nausea made me swallow hard. Suddenly, something shifted. It was as if the air around me had torn open. The shadow recoiled for a moment, trembling as if under attack. I seized the opportunity and shouted the prayer out loud, breaking the force that had pinned me to the bed. It was like a 100-pound weight had been lifted off me. I threw myself backward, pressing against the wall as the creature writhed, letting out a sound that didn't belong to this world, something between a muffled growl and a human wail. The shadow then dissolved rapidly, sucked out through the open window as if pulled by a strong wind. The room was empty, but the curtains still swayed unevenly, as if something had just passed through. I scrambled to my feet and slammed the window shut, locking it again, then backed away, trying to catch my breath. I sat in the corner of the room with the lights on until dawn. The silence of the early morning was replaced by the distant sounds of cars and birds, but none of it brought relief. The feeling of being watched never faded. It was like at any moment, if I let my guard down, something could come back. In the days that followed, I avoided being alone at night. Any strange noise, a creak in the floorboards, the whisper of the wind, a distant meow, made my heart race. I researched supernatural experiences, trying to find something that matched what I'd seen. That's when I came across old stories about jinn, mystical creatures made of smokeless fire, capable of taking on imperfect forms to deceive humans. The descriptions matched what I'd witnessed: the unstable appearance, the fixed gaze, the distorted shape. Some accounts said they draw near to test your fear, that they feed on it, and that once they find you, they can return, even after years. Now when I think back to that night, I don't see that cat as an ordinary animal. That stare, that feeling of a spiritual presence, the weight in the air, it all tells me it was something much older and far more dangerous. I still recite the prayer before I sleep, even if it feels silly, because deep down, I know it's not over. It's just waiting for the right moment to come back. And when it does, I don't know if a simple prayer will be enough to save me again. Creepy, right? What did you think of the story? On a scale from 0 to 10, what rating would you give it? Drop your answer in the comments. After something so intense and personal, like an encounter with a jinn, it's clear that certain presences don't choose a place to appear. Just like in the story you're about to hear, where an entire town hides a secret that's been burning for decades. The town seemed swallowed by a constant haze, but it wasn't fog. It was smoke. It didn't rise from chimneys or recent fires. It came from the ground. They said the fire had been burning down there since before I was born, fed by coal seams that never died out. The air smelled metallic and heavy, and even in winter the temperature seemed to climb a little higher when you got close to the blocked-off streets. Warning signs cautioned about ground collapse and toxic gases. Abandoned houses, twisted lampposts, cracked sidewalks. It looked like a post-apocalyptic movie set. It was the kind of place where anyone with half a brain would avoid setting foot. But not my Aunt Clara. She lived in a small town nearby, about 20 minutes away, which had the same eerie vibe, though without the underground fire. Even as a kid, I thought her house was different. Not bad exactly, just heavy. It was an old 2-story building painted white, but the wood was starting to peel. I only found out years later that it sat right on top of a tangled network of old coal mining tunnels. And then, everything started to make sense. The house's history wasn't a secret among the town's older folks. Before my aunt moved in, a couple had lived there. The wife, they said, fell down the stairs to the basement and died instantly. The husband, well, he never recovered. A year later, he was found dead in the same spot, at the foot of the stairs. Officially, it was a heart attack, but people whispered another story, that he'd been pulled by something. These weren't the kind of tales that made it into the newspaper, but everyone knew. My aunt had no idea about any of this when she bought the place. She just saw the low price and the perfect space for her art studio. She was a practical woman, with no patience for local legends. And for the first few months, everything seemed fine. But over time, strange things started happening. First, it was the kitchen radio. She'd set it to her usual station, but when she came back, it would be playing something else. Old songs, the kind you only hear on vintage records. She thought it might be a problem with the radio, until she replaced it with a new one, and it kept happening. The nights changed, too. She told me that sometimes she'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain she'd heard a door slam. Other times, she'd hear slow footsteps in the upstairs hallway, even when she was alone. I'll never forget the first time I slept over and experienced it myself. It was like someone was walking slowly, not bothering to hide the noise. The sound would come closer, stop near the bedroom door, and then nothing. But the worst part for her was the basement. No matter the time of day, the air down there was always colder, as if it were coming from somewhere much deeper than the tunnels. She said she could feel a strong spiritual presence there, something that had no intention of leaving. Every time she had to go down to grab something, she described a thick negative energy that made her skin crawl. And even when no one was around, she swore she could feel the weight of a fixed gaze following her every move. As the months went by, the strange occurrences became part of the routine. She started talking to herself around the house, as if warning something, that she was coming upstairs or moving things around. And it was during one of these one-sided conversations that she made a decision. If there really was a spirit there, maybe it was best to try and make a deal. In her mind, it would be simple. Ask for peace in exchange for respect. She promised she wouldn't renovate or make any major changes, that she'd keep the house as it was, and she asked to be left to live in peace. After that, things strangely settled down. The footsteps continued, but less often, and the doors stopped slamming on their own. She still felt the presence in the basement, but now it was more like a shadow watching from a distance, not a constant threat. For years, my aunt lived like this, in a silent balance between the world of the living and whatever was trapped in that house. And it was only much later that the peace was broken. Years after her silent agreement, my aunt decided to sell the house, not because she wanted to run away, but because her health no longer allowed her to care for such a large property alone. She was convinced that as long as the deal was kept, nothing bad would happen. And up until that point, it was true. The new owners were a younger couple, with plans to renovate everything, and that, according to my aunt, was when the balance began to crack. She still lived in town and would drive by the house occasionally. She noticed right away in the first few weeks that they'd started where they shouldn't have, the basement. They replaced the old staircase, removed some load-bearing walls, and installed new lighting. She told me that just looking at it, she could feel something was off. It was as if the house, which had always seemed quiet, was now restless. The dark windows looked deeper, almost like eyes watching. Soon the story started. First, the neighbor across the street mentioned lights turning on and off by themselves. Then, noises in the middle of the night, not footsteps, but something heavy being dragged across the floor. One day, one of the new owners showed up at the town market with his arm in a sling. He said he'd fallen down the basement stairs, but the older folks exchanged knowing glances. History was repeating itself. Then came the day it all ended. I was at my aunt's house when we heard the news. The basement floor had collapsed. An entire section had caved in, swallowing whatever was down there. The fire department said it was probably caused by a collapse in the old coal tunnels, something that happened from time to time in the area. But for those who knew the history, that explanation didn't quite add up. especially since the exact spot where the floor gave way was the same place where the husband from that old family had died. The news spread fast. Some said the new couple had moved out immediately, leaving furniture and belongings behind. Others claimed they'd seen the man walking alone through town days later, but without his wife. The scariest rumor, though, came from the retired miners, that the hole in the basement didn't just lead to a collapsed tunnel, but to a space much deeper, unmarked on any map, from which rose the smell of smoke and burning iron. One of them swore he'd seen something down there, something moving slowly, as if it were climbing. My aunt never drove down that street again. When someone mentioned the house, she'd just shake her head and say, "You shouldn't mess with places where death had already staked its claim." One day, she told me something she'd never said before. She said that in her last week living there, she'd heard a faint voice in the basement, almost a whisper, saying, "Leave it as it is." At the time, she thought it was her imagination. Now she believed it was a warning, and that what happened afterward was the answer for those who chose to ignore it. The town where the underground fire still burned remained, surrounded by blocked-off streets and empty houses. But for me, what truly sent chills down my spine wasn't the fire slowly consuming the earth below. It was the idea that in some places, tragedies don't fade with time. They pile up, layer upon layer, waiting for someone to break the silence so they can be set free. And sometimes I catch myself wondering if that collapse wasn't just the result of decades of shoddy mining, if, in some way, the spirit that lived in that house decided to take with it the peace that belonged to it. Because to this day, no one's been able to rebuild on that land. The hole is still there, like an open wound, releasing a warm vapor that doesn't match the weather. Those who pass by swear they feel a sudden cold, as if something is passing through them. And deep down, I think we all know that's not just the heat of burning coal. It's the breath of something still waiting. So bizarre. Stories like this show that sometimes it's impossible to separate physical danger from the supernatural. And the next case takes that to an even scarier level, inside a barn where something had been waiting to be seen. That night, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky was already painted a deep blue, and the last orange streaks of sunset were fading behind the hills. The abandoned farmhouse stood just a few miles away, but the mere thought of stepping inside carried an odd weight. Everyone in town knew the stories. Voices out of nowhere, windows slamming shut on their own, shadowy figures darting past the cracks. Still, my brother and I had managed something rare: permission to visit. Our parents were friends with the grandkids of the old owners, and that got us inside a place most people only dared to glance at from a distance. The barn was what drew me in the most. A towering, dark wooden structure, slightly warped by time. I wanted to see the swallows roosting in the rafters, and for that I'd have to go in after sundown. It was a simple plan, or at least it seemed that way. The farmhouse itself stood farther back, its windows empty and the front door always shut. We crossed the silent yard, feeling the uneven ground beneath our feet, until we stood face to face with the barn's massive door. Of the two entrances, only the front one still worked. The back door had been jammed for decades. Pushing that door open felt like waking the past. The smell of damp wood and old dust hit us immediately. Inside, the darkness was almost solid, swallowing any detail the moonlight tried to reveal. The light switch was tucked in the far corner, away from the door, forcing us to navigate a narrow passage guided only by the dim beam of my phone's flashlight. Every step made the floorboards creak in a way that seemed to echo up into the rafters. When the light flickered on, the barn came alive. The swallows were perched almost motionless, only shifting their heads now and then. The ceiling was so high that the light barely touched the farthest corners. There were piles of old tools, scattered hay bales, and an ancient plow leaning against the wall. I felt a mix of fascination and unease, like I was intruding on something that didn't belong to me. We stayed there for a few minutes, watching the birds. The silence was so deep that every breath seemed too loud. Then we decided to leave. My brother offered to go turn off the light using his phone's flashlight to guide him. I waited by the front door, leaning against the frame. That's when I heard him call out. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual, but there was something off in his voice. Come here." I didn't like the way he said it. His voice was steady, but there was a tension beneath it that made my skin prickle. I took a few steps forward and realized he wasn't moving. He stood frozen, shining his light into the farthest corner of the barn. As I got closer, he flicked the light off in one quick motion and brushed past me, heading straight for the door. "Let's go," he muttered, not looking back. I didn't question him. I just shut the door and started walking beside him. The air outside the barn felt lighter, but the silence between us was heavy. It wasn't until we were almost back to the house that he finally spoke without slowing his pace. "There was someone in there." I stopped. He kept walking, like he didn't want to repeat himself. I hurried to catch up and asked what he'd seen. His answer came fast, but it was sharp. A figure. Tall. It was just standing there about 6 feet away from me. It didn't have a mouth. A chill ran up my spine. At the same time, a tightness in my chest reminded me of the strange feeling I'd had while waiting for him by the door. Like the air was thicker. Like something was watching me. I hadn't seen anything, but it was clear. Something was there. It wasn't just our imagination. The rest of the walk back to the house was silent. The wet grass muffled our footsteps, and every time the wind blew, the distant creak of the barn's wood seemed to follow us. When we finally shut the door behind us, it felt like an invisible weight had stayed outside. But the memory of what happened, that came in with us. We sat at the kitchen table, the yellow light casting long shadows on the walls. He told me more. The figure had been motionless, but the energy around it seemed to vibrate, like it was sucking the air out of the room. The eyes, if they were eyes, were just two dark pits sunken into its face. There was no expression, no movement, just that presence, standing in the silence. The feeling he described matched mine. Even though I hadn't seen anything, I knew we hadn't been alone in there. It was like the barn held not just the history of that farm, but something that was never meant to be seen. Something that belonged to the dark. We decided we wouldn't go back there at night. We could come up with 1,000 excuses to avoid facing it again, but deep down we knew the truth. No matter how many years passed, the barn would always carry that same weight. And that presence, it would keep waiting, silently, for the next foolhardy step that dared to cross its threshold. Terrifying, right? A figure with no mouth is enough to haunt anyone for years, but some things don't even have to show themselves to leave a mark. Like a Ouija board that revealed a family secret long before the truth came out. But before we move on, if you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying these stories. So go ahead and hit that like button. It lets YouTube know you love this kind of content, and it makes sure you won't miss any of our horror stories. Nobody warns you that some answers arrive like a weight in the air, like a door creaking open by itself in the dead of night. I learned that on some forgettable Saturday when me and Jake pressed our fingers onto a Ouija board his cousin had brought back from a trip, still smelling of fresh cardboard. It was the kind of night where strange things felt more likely, as if the walls themselves were holding onto a secret just waiting to slip out. We called it a game, but the curiosity was real. The feeling of being watched settled in before we even asked the first question. Like the house itself had pulled up a chair to spectate. We started with the usual script. Is anyone here? The planchette didn't budge, and I almost laughed, until I felt a faint vibration at my fingertip, like when you touch a speaker humming with bass. The planchette slid to yes. Jake smirked that half-smile he uses when he's pretending to be unfazed. We'd agreed not to ask anything too personal, but that rule vanished in 5 minutes. Jake wanted to test the real deal, not just mess around with silly questions. Either it's real or it's psychology, he said. I nodded, partly to keep up the bravado, partly because the energy in the room had already turned sour. Then he cut to the chase. Jake never knew his biological father's name. He grew up with his stepdad, a solid guy, but that empty space in his story always echoed. He took a deep breath, readjusted his fingers, and asked, "What's my real father's name?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had texture, weight. The planchette glided as if someone else's hand were guiding it alongside ours. I didn't piece it together letter by letter. The word formed whole in my mind, like it had been spoken directly into my thoughts. Martin. The planchette stopped, and I let out a crooked laugh, the kind you use to shake off your own unease. Martin? Seriously? I asked. Jake stared at the board for a long moment as if the answer might rewrite itself. He said his mom had always told a different story, that the name didn't make sense. We joked it off, called it a coincidence, packed the board away and pretended life had snapped back to normal. But that name lingered in the air. On the walk home, I could still feel something unseen trailing behind me. Not with footsteps, but with intention. The next week unfolded like any other, but small things started to unsettle us. I spent a night wide awake, convinced someone was watching me from the doorway. Every time I lifted my head, there was nothing, just a hallway holding its breath. We texted each other in the middle of the night like neighbors passing a cup of water through a window during a fire. No one could explain it, but it was better than being alone inside your own head. Over time, Martin became an inside joke. If someone asked an unanswerable question, I'd shrug and say, "Ask Martin." The laughter helped, but it didn't erase everything. Jake still talked about dreams of endless hallways and numbered doors, and the memory of that word glowing in the dark always surfaced, no matter how much we tried to bury it. 2 years passed. Graduation loomed, and life seemed ready to open new doors. On a gray Monday, Jake showed up early and waited for me on the bench by the basketball court, the one with the peeling blue paint. When I sat down, he hesitated, like the words were heavy. "My mom talked to me last night," he said. "She admitted she lied." My stomach twisted. "Lied about what?" I asked. He stared at the ground. "About my dad. His name is Martin." The words hit like ice water in my veins. I searched his face for a hint of irony and found none. I thought of the planchette, the yes, the way the name had materialized whole that night. No one knew that name, not me, not Jake, not our friends. And yet, the board had given the right answer before his own family. We sat in silence for minutes, watching the court buzz with noise as if a pane of glass separated us from the rest of the world. Jake said his mom had cried, apologized, and confessed she thought she was protecting him, that erasing the name would erase the past. Instead, the silence had only grown louder. After the revelation, other coincidences started surfacing, as if reality had decided to underline the same passage. A glitched transaction receipt on Jake's phone read, "Recipient MRT," like the machine had swallowed the vowels just to mock us. A misdelivered package at his neighbor's gate had Martin as the sender. At the grocery store, an old song's chorus repeated the name on loop. The feeling of being watched sharpened whenever the topic came up. That's when Jake showed up with the Ouija board in a black plastic bag. "I need to ask again," he said. We went down to my basement, set the board on the floor, and placed our fingers on the planchette. He asked, "Who spoke that name that night?" The planchette moved with infuriating calm and spelled out a single word. "Family." Jake pressed, "Whose family?" The answer came, "Blood." The chill in the basement wasn't from a draft. It was internal, like someone had thrown open a window inside my chest. The negative energy crawled up my neck. Jake lifted his hand an inch, then put it back. "Do you want something?" he asked. The planchette didn't move. The silence clicked into place like a lid. The message wasn't about debt or threats. It was a reminder. Some truths run in the blood before they're ever named. We closed the box, stored it in his aunt's attic, and agreed to leave it at that. In the days that followed, Jake's mom shared fragments of the story. She'd met his father during a turbulent time. The relationship had burned out fast, and fear of judgment had outweighed the truth. She'd scrubbed the name from every conversation and memory, like performing surgery on the past. It wasn't a villain's tale. It was the story of someone trying to survive. Jake listened, absorbed it all, and carried a new kind of silence. Quieter, older, the kind that doesn't ask for applause. Life went on. Tests, applications, goodbyes, forced smiles for photos. But every now and then, something would whisper the name. On the bus, a kid pointed out the window and said, "That Martin guy is over there," as if reading an invisible sign. At home, a picture frame fell the exact moment I thought about it. It wasn't chaos. It was an eerie alignment, a tug at our attention. When I think about what scared me most, it wasn't the board itself. It was the trail of the supernatural it left behind. Subtle, persistent. The idea that something, somewhere, knew before the world did. Some call it coincidence. Others say it's the ideomotor effect, that we push without realizing where we want to go. I read articles, watched videos, tried to memorize explanations. But nothing erases the unsettling detail. That name wasn't floating around. It didn't exist in our world. And yet the Ouija spoke it. Not with drama or noise, but with the sober certainty of someone confirming what had been hidden. There were nights I woke up convinced someone was sitting in the desk chair facing me. The whole room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the walls were breathing. I whispered the name without meaning to. Martin. The weight in the air lifted. I fell back asleep, as if recognition had reset something. When I told Jake, he looked at me like he understood a language he never wanted to learn. Saying the name takes the charge out of the fear, he said. And it was true. Naming it calmed the room. I never touched the board again, not out of terror, but respect. What it gave us wasn't a show, it was a mirror. It revealed that some questions dig too deep, and you can't control the water once it finds a path. Trust in family shook, of course. Jake had to reassemble his own story, piecing it together with patience. I learned by proxy that secrets create echoes, and when you call, those echoes answer. Maybe the Ouija just frames what's already there. A way to pause, press your finger down, and admit what's been lingering. Now, when people ask if I believe, I don't answer with theories. I describe the weight of the silence, the feeling of being watched by nothing, the shiver down my spine when information arrives fully formed, the negative energy dissolving when you give it a name. I tell them about the blue bench at school, the numbered doors in Jake's dreams, the cold basement with the word family hanging like a warning. Sometimes at night, I pass by my closet and get the sense there's an invisible chair tucked there, occupied by someone waiting for me to ask another question. I don't ask. I've learned enough. I just whisper thanks for what's already been given and move on. In rare moments, I feel the house hold its breath with me, like that first night. And in my mind, a word returns. Whole, unspelled, without suspense. Martin. It doesn't come with threats. Comes with the quiet certainty of someone who's always known the way and still needed someone brave enough to ask. Horrifying. What did you think of this one? On a scale from 0 to 10, what rating would you give it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I was terrified of a piece of paper. Not a dark basement, not a shadow in the hallway, not some recycled urban legend. A cheap flyer tacked to a pole near school, with a flaming jack-o'-lantern and a jagged, grinning mouth that seemed to stretch too wide. The moment I laid eyes on it, the world tilted, like the street had suddenly turned into a ramp. The air grew thick, my chest tightened, and the feeling of being watched clung to the back of my neck. That's when the unease sparked, like a struck match. The neighborhood was one of those picture-perfect American suburbs. Manicured lawns, trees lined up like soldiers, the scent of caramel in the evening air, and neighbors who went overboard with fake spiderwebs. I loved October. The movies on TV, the jack-o'-lanterns glowing on porches. But that flyer, it gave off a different vibe. Pumpkin Blaze Night. The letters dripped like melting wax, and a line of kids walked toward the pumpkin's mouth, as if it were silently swallowing them whole. I tried to read the details, the dates, the attractions, but my eyes watered, and the image pulsed like it was burning. I stepped back without thinking. In the days that followed, weird things started happening at home. The doorbell rang twice, but no one was there. The hallway lights flickered as I walked by. The bathroom window fogged up. No shower, no steam. I told myself it was coincidence, but my body wasn't buying it. At night, lying in bed, I'd see the outline of that burning pumpkin seared into my mind. and the bad energy felt like invisible threads spreading through my room. My mom tucked the flyer away with coupons and takeout menus. In that drawer you open without thinking. I'd open it, see the orange glow, and slam it shut, my hand shaking. Halloween came and went, and so did the intensity of the fear. The memory stuck around like a crooked picture on the wall, there but easy to ignore. Years passed. School, part-time jobs, the icy steering wheel of my first winter, people drifting in and out of my life. One autumn evening, I stopped at a fast food joint off the highway. I sat with my burger, and there it was, in the flyer rack. Orange cover, flaming jack-o'-lantern, similar font. The same line of kids turning to shadows inside that grinning mouth. It couldn't be the same one, but it wasn't just similar either. I picked it up with 2 fingers like it was electrified and took it home. I don't know why. Maybe to prove I'd grown up. Buddy, our dog, noticed something I was still pretending not to see. The late afternoons when the sky turned copper, he'd change. He'd plant his paws on the windowsill, head low, fur bristling, staring outside. In the backyard, he'd press against the fence, growling at nothing, or something. It was like he heard footsteps we couldn't. I'd call his name, he'd glance at me, then go back to watching the street, pulled by some silent thread. The first time I saw the figures, I doubted my own eyes. Between the sidewalk tree and the pole, in the dark pocket the streetlights couldn't reach, something small moved. It looked like a child, but there was no face, no quick glint of living eyes, just shadow within shadow, a shape that only made sense when you weren't looking directly at it. I called out, "You okay over there?" like I was hearing myself from far away, and Buddy barked, locked onto the exact spot I didn't want to see. The figures stepped back slowly, 2 wet footsteps, and vanished behind the pole like the night had tucked them into a pocket. By then, I'd taped the new flyer to my bulletin board, next to my school calendar, and a to-do list I never finished. That's when the blackout started, always at dusk. The microwave reset, the radio hissed, the hallway lights flickered in an almost calculated rhythm. The fear returned, but this time with a sickening certainty. It all seemed synced to the flyer. The pumpkin's grin drew my eyes, and the painted flame seemed to glow on its own. I'd look away, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like a smell that refuses to fade. One night, the supernatural crossed the threshold. Half asleep, I heard my name whispered from outside. A child's voice, but with no childhood in it. Just ash in the tone. Buddy bolted upright, growling like I'd never heard before, teeth bared, body rigid. The voice called again, softer, and my bedroom wall bathed in an orange glow like a bonfire was breathing in the yard. The bad energy was thick, almost tangible, and my brain finally got the message. This wasn't just my imagination. I got up, went to the board, ripped the flyer down and crushed it in my fist. I threw it in the sink and turned the faucet on full blast. The black ink bled into thin veins, swirling down the drain. The same moment the light stopped flickering, Buddy stopped growling and collapsed exhausted. The house sighed. So did I. It was like lifting a weight from the water. I watched the soggy paper, and for a second I swear the drawn eye glowed under the water. I whispered, "Enough," and kept at it until it was pulp. No face, no teeth, no fire. Curiosity, which is just a polite form of recklessness, pushed me to test it. Days later, I picked up a similar flyer at a community market and taped it to the board. Nothing happened. No shadows, no coded messages in the lights, no footsteps in the grass. I breathed a sigh of relief, almost laughing at myself. Just suggestion, I thought. A bad memory. The next week, I went back to the fast food place. There was a fresh stack. I grabbed one and recognized the strokes like you recognize the handwriting of someone who's marked your life. The exaggerated, jagged grin, the wrong kind of glow in the eyes, the line of kids slipping into the mouth. I took it home without questioning why. Dusk fell fast like someone had flipped a switch. The doorbell rang twice, then once more, and stopped. Buddy froze at the window, muscles locked, a growl trapped in his throat. Between the tree and the pole, 3 small figures gathered, shoulders hunched, head slightly tilted. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their gaze. The sensation of being watched crawled up my spine and hummed behind my ear. I grabbed the flyer from the board with the kind of resolve you only find when you realize all your choices have led to one. I went to the kitchen, grabbed my dad's grill lighter, and touched the flame to the edge. The fire caught eagerly, like it had been waiting. When it reached the drawn eye, Buddy barked once as if sealing a ritual. The three figures retreated and imploded into the shadow, vanishing without a sound, like someone had erased a line on paper. The hallway light steadied, the air stilled, and the world fit back into my chest. I waited until the paper turned to ash, wrapped it carefully, and tossed it in the metal trash can. Then I stood there, hands flat on the counter, listening to my heartbeat settle back into place. Since then, I don't touch flyers with that specific design. Generic versions pop up every October, and that's all they are. Decoration, invites, marketing. That one? It's different. It feels like it carries a trace of something spiritual, a breath from somewhere beyond ink and paper. I know the easy explanation is good design, visual triggers, an impressionable childhood, and maybe that's part of it. But there's also what doesn't fit on a spreadsheet. Twice the event started when the paper crossed the threshold. Twice they stopped when I destroyed it. Could be coincidence, or it could be something else, something we only admit in the dead of night. Now, when the October sky turns pumpkin rind orange and the wind scatters leaves across the sidewalk, I walk Buddy and feel the world in its place. We pass orange porches, the smell of apple cider, kids laughing. At home, my hand sometimes hovers over the old kitchen drawer where the papers used to sleep. I don't open it. I don't need to see the orange to remember what fear taught me. Some objects work like doors. I opened one by accident. I closed it the best I could, and if anyone asks, I'll say without shame it was scary marketing. And something beyond marketing. Because some designs don't just announce events, they bring them along. And that was the problem. And the proof. Zenosi, you made it all the way here, after that flyer that seemed to carry something from another world. If you stayed till the end, leave a comment saying, "Haunted Flyer," just so I know you hung on until the very last second. If you enjoy listening to these strange, mystery-filled stories, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. We always bring something that leaves you with that unsettling feeling in the back of your mind. And don't forget to hit that like button. It helps keep this conversation about the unexplainable alive right here. There's another video on the screen that keeps the same chilling atmosphere. Click it and come with me, because the next story might be even more disturbing.